technical problem. So let's continue. In this chapter, we will learn about the how Britishers, how the Indian leaders, they forced the Britishers to leave the country, So yes, question we were discussing regarding as a question. So what reasons responsible for? What were the reasons responsible for the increase of a nationalist feeling among Indians? Nationalist feelings among Indians. What were the reasons responsible for the national movements in India? National movements in India. So what were the reasons responsible for the national movements in India? In India. Okay, leave it. So these are the reasons responsible for the nationalist movement in India. First, as a oppressive nature of colonial expansion. At the early phase of colonial policies, Britishers, they started to conquest a larger number of Indian territories under the British Empire. So under such circumstances, they oppressively controlled over the Indians, for which as Britishers introduced a large number of their policies. For example, subsidiary alliance, doctrine of lapse, such kind of the policies, policy of a paramountcy, which we discussed in a second chapter of history, policy of a paramountcy, such policies used by the Britishers for expansion of their territories. So first, as a oppressive nature of colonial expression, or on your book has written as the British conquest of a territories and a takeover of kingdom. Second, introduction of a new law and administrative institutions. Britishers, they introduced as a newer number of the law which were highly beneficial for them. They were beneficial for them, not for the Indians. For example, the Sedition Act of 1870. Sedition Act of 1870, which restricted or affected as the civil liberties of Indians. Vernacular Press Act of 1878. Vernacular Press Act of 1878, which directly impact over the liberty of a press. It can't publish such news which was as against of the British Empire. So Britishers, they enacted a new law and administrative institutions. Third, changes in the lives of peasants and tribals. Means the commercialization of agriculture. Britishers introduced as a new land revenue systems. In such land revenue systems, they highly beneficial for the British Empire. How? Because through as a land revenue system, the income of a company, it was as an increase in a manifold. Income of company increase due to as a such land revenue systems which adversely impact on Indian farmers. Fourth, as a commercialization of agriculture. Commercialization generally as a term used for when we produce a crops for the profits. But at that time, in British age, Britishers produced only as a such cash crops which were high demanded in European countries. To use such number of cash crops in their own industries located at England and to earn as the more profits, for which as a Britishers they introduce as a commercialization, for which as Britishers introduce as opium and tea production in India to exchange with the silk produced in China. Not for the purpose of Indian, it was as the motive of Britishers to exchange silk produced in China with the opium and tea produced in India. Clear? Next, fourth, educational changes in the 19th century. Some of the historians, they consider that the changes in education which introduced in 1854 by the Wood's Dispatch. such kind of the changes initiated to improve as the educational standards. But the basic purpose of the Britishers, it was that to use Indians in administrative services, for which as they need as a workers, and such workers, those workers which were living in India, they can't understand their policies. To force them as to follow their rules and regulations, that for which as a Britishers they introduce as a educational changes in India. Next, as a debates regarding as a condition of women. Britishers they introduce as a number of changes in Indian society which consider as the bad by the orthodox Indians. They consider that as the direct attack over their society. Then the Britishers they challenges to the caste system also and took as a number of social and religious reforms. Next, Britishers they introduced as a policy of a racial discrimination in administration. They given as a higher post to the British officials, neither to the Indians, which you learned in a 5th chapter of a revolt of 1857, in which we discussed that the military causes, the highest rank given to the Indian soldier as the Subedar, and above of which as basically they use as a British soldiers and officials, neither as a Indian soldiers. So this was also as a discrimination makes as a feeling of inferiority among the Indians. Destruction of a traditional industry and crafts. Due to the industrialization, newer industries, which we learned in a 6th chapter of our history, craftsmen, weavers, due to as an industrialization in England, which leads as a purchasing of a raw material, export of a raw material from India towards as a England, and afterwards manufactured goods sold in Indian markets at low cost. Under such circumstances, due to as a deficiency of a raw material and competition with the foreign goods, Indian traditional industries ruined. They stopped their production. So those which lost their jobs under such process of a Britishers, they took as a step against of the British Empire. Next, 9th is a lack of popular support for legislations of social reforms. Most of the people at that time, these were not supported as those social reforms which took place by Britishers. That's why as they took as a stand against our Britishers. 9th, 10th, introduction of a uniform legal system. Introduction of a uniform legal system for the legal matters of India, for which as a British judges were appointed neither as a Indian judges as separately. Indian judges were not separately as appointed. Their best example as a Lala Lajpat Rai, it opposed as a call of a commission which was named as a Simon Commission. That commission, which was headed by the British official, they started as to take as a decisions in relation to the Indians also. In relation to the Indian, the introduction of the postal services. Next, 11, introduction of the postal services, which we learned in a revolt of 1857. Introduction of a postal services, common currency, railways, telegraph system, which helped to link the different parts of a country, through which as people directly as connected with the different parts of a country and struggle for the freedom of nation. Next, we as the introduction of a Western education helps the Indians to learn about those changes which occurred in other parts of the world. For example, through as a Western literature, Indians familiar how does as the French people they work for the liberty, justice and fraternity. Through as the Western education, Indians they familiar with the Russian Revolution, which was occurred on 1907. So it also improved as a feeling of a struggle against of the British Empire. At that time, 12th reason responsible for the improvements of a growth of a nationalist feelings among the Indians as the writings of a Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. Deenbandhu Mitra, and Rabindranath Tagore, which instilled among common people a feeling of a pride in and respect for their own past. All these reasons responsible for the improvement of a nationalist feelings among the Indians. Clear? This was our chapter. So let's start our chapter. At the time of the last 2 decades of a 19th century, the feeling of a nationalism, it was as a started to improve among the Indians. Why? Because at that time there were the three law enacted by the Britishers, 3 acts passed by the British further exposed the racial discrimination nature of the colonial state. These acts were Arms Act. First is the Arms Act of 1878. Arms Act of 1878. It was passed by the Viceroy Lord Lytton. Lytton on 1878 passed the Arms Act, according to which Indians, they can't possess as the arms and ammunitions. It can't be as a possessed by the Indians. It can only kept by the British officials. As according to the Arms Act passed in 1878, it prohibited the Indians from possessing the firearms without licenses. Clear? Second disputed act was as the Vernacular Press Act of 1878. Vernacular Press Act of 1878. Vernacular Press Act of 1878. It's also passed by the Viceroy Lord Lytton in 1878, which allowed the government to confiscate newspapers if they published anything objectionable against of British Empire. And third, it was as a Ilbert Bill. Third was the Ilbert Bill. Ilbert Bill of 1883. It was passed by the Lord Ripon. Lord Ripon passed, Viceroy Lord Ripon passed the Ilbert Bill of 1883. According to this act, only as the judges of Indian origin to try the Europeans in India. The Europeans in India reacted harshly and the government amended that bill. Means as the Indians, they can, as the Indian judges, they can take as the decisions on matters related with the Britishers, but against after this act, when Britishers, English people opposed, then finally as that bill modified by the Britishers. In this process of the nationalist feelings, Britishers tried to suppress such kind of the nationalist feelings amongst the Indians. So for which as they took as a decisions for the formation of an Indian National Congress. Britishers decided to form as the Indian National Congress. The basic objective behind the formation of a Congress was that to engage such kind of the leaders which oppose British policies in our public places. They have to busy in a political structure. So to promote the interests of Indian people, several political associations were established. Important associations among them were the British India Association, first British India Association, second Bombay Presidency Association, and third, All India National Congress. Congress formed in 1885. In 1885, Britishers, they formed as the Indian National Congress. Formed by the A.O. Hume, a retired British civil servant, A.O. Hume, H-U-M-E. A.O. Hume formed the Indian National Congress. Indian National Congress formed in 1885 by A.O. Hume. A.O. Hume. The first session at Bombay. A.O. Hume at Bombay. The first session of Congress, it was held at Bombay under the W.C. Banerjee. First session of Congress, it was held at Bombay with the 72 delegates. It was headed by the W.C. Banerjee. W.C. Banerjee headed the first session of a Congress at Bombay in 1885. The Indian National Congress played an important role in articulating the nationalist demands in front of the Britishers. Those demands which earlier not possible for the Indians to raise in front of the Britishers, now through the formation of a Congress, it's easy for the political leaders and nationalist leaders to represent the demands of Indians or the problems associated with the administration in front of Britishers. This process, it was as a continued till as the 1890s. Then finally, in 1890, Congress split into two parts. These parts were the radicals and moderates. Radicals, R-A-D-I-C-A-L-S. Radicals and moderates. M-O-D-E-R-A-T-E-S. These two, the members of these two groups were included in a Congress, but due to as their ideologies, they were varied. They were different from each other. Moderates were basically as those which were ready to work as under leadership of Britishers. Moderates agreed to work under the leadership of Britishers, whereas radical leaders, they tried to struggle for a freedom of a nation. Means they work for a free country from a British control. But with these two group of people, there was one more group. These were not belong from the Congress, but they also struggled for a freedom of nation, these were known as a revolutionaries. Bhagat Singh was a revolutionary. Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, Ashfaqullah Khan, Batukeshwar Dutt, Ram Prasad Bismil, these were the revolutionaries. Kartar Singh Saraba, Uday. Congress leaders, they work as the set framework on which as the country governed. So let's start from the moderates first. Moderates. In the beginning of a Congress, it was dominated by a group of leaders called the moderates. They believed that, note it down, what was the ideology of a moderates? They believed that the British respected the ideals of freedom and justice, and would accept the just demands of Indians. They sought gradual reforms and not independence from British rule. They agreed that the moderate leaders agreed with the Britishers that if they are ruling over a country, then the country it can properly administer. This was as an ideology of a moderate leaders. Moderates gradually reforms and not demanded as independence from a British rule. They wanted the British to train Indians in the art and self-government. To voice their demands, they adopted the peaceful and constitutional methods and pressed for changes through the persuasion and petitions. Such moderate leaders, they mobilized the public opinion through speeches and writings. They spread as an idea among the people regarding as the beneficial and goodwills of a British policy in relation to the Indians. Such moderate leaders, these were having as some of the major demands in a Congress party. They raised such demands in relation to the people of a country. Next question, what were the demands of a moderate leaders? What were the demands of moderate leaders of Indian National Congress? First, greater voice for Indians in the government and in administration. Greater voice for Indians in the government and in administration. Greater voice for Indians in the government and in administration. Second, reduction in expenditure on military matters. Reduction in expenditure on military matters. Reduction in total expenses which has spending over a military matters. It should be as a reduce and use for Indians. Third, reforms to make the legislative councils more representative. Reforms to make the legislative councils more representatives. They demanded as moderate leaders demanded as the more freedoms for Indians. Reforms to make the legislative councils more representative. Fourth, reduction of taxes in general. Reduction of taxes in general and land revenue. Reduction of taxes in general and land revenue. Reduction of taxes in general and land revenue. Next, fifth, change in the arbitrary economic policies of the colonial state. Change in the arbitrary economic policies of the colonial state. Next, greater freedom of speech and expression for the Indians. Greater freedom of speech and expression for the Indians. Next, agricultural reform through the setting up of credit facilities, agricultural reform through the setting up of credit facilities in rural areas, reduction of land revenue, construction of irrigation works, and reduction in the salt tax. The important leaders of a moderate were W.C. Banerjee, Bomkesh Chandra Banerjee, W.C. Banerjee, Romesh Chandra Dutt, S. Subramania Iyer, Dadabhai Naroji. These were the moderate leaders. Which favored that the British administration, it can only as given as a rights to the Indians. Clear? Tomorrow we will start from the radicals.